Hi there, I'm Patch, and you'll be reading with me today. Today we're going to be reading Night Shift by Stephen King. Did you know that Night Shift is actually a series of short stories? Is everybody ready? Great! Now, let's settle down, grab some cocoa, and let's begin. He became aware of the corn fragrance in his nose now, all around him. The wind through the tops of the plants made a sound like voices, soothing. Whatever had been done in the name of this corn, it was now his protector. They were getting closer. Running, hunched over, he hurried up the row he was in, crossed over, doubled back, and crossed over more rows. He tried to keep the voices always on his left. But as the afternoon progressed, that became harder and harder to do. The voices had grown faint, and often the rustling sound of the corn obscured them altogether. He would run, listen, run again. The earth was hard-packed, and his stocking feet left little or no trace. When he stopped much later, the sun was hanging over the fields to his right, red and inflamed. When he looked at his watch, he saw that it was 7:15. The sun had stained the corn tops a reddish gold, but here the shadows were dark and deep. He cocked his head, listening. With the coming of the sunset, the wind had died entirely, and the corn stood still, exhaling its aroma of growth into the warm air. If they were still in the corn, they were either far away or just hunkered down and listening. But Bert didn't think a bunch of kids, even crazy ones, could be quiet for that long. He expected they had done the most kid-like thing, regardless of the consequences for them. They had given up and gone home. He turned toward the setting sun, which had sunk between the raftered clouds on the horizon, and began to walk. If he cut on a diagonal through the rows, always keeping the setting sun ahead of him, he would be bound to strike Route 17 sooner or later. The ache in his arm had settled into a dull throb that was nearly pleasant, and the good feeling was still with him. He decided that as long as he was here, he would let the good feeling exist in him without guilt. The guilt would return when he had to face the authorities and account for what had happened to Gatlin. But that could wait. He passed through the corn, thinking he had never felt so keenly aware. 15 minutes later, the sun was only a hemisphere poking over the horizon, and he stopped again, his new awareness clicking into a pattern he didn't like. It was vaguely frightening. He cocked his head. The corn was rustling. Bert had been aware of that for some time, but he had just put it together with something else. The wind was still. How could that be? He looked around warily, expecting to see the smiling boys in their Quaker coats creeping out of the corn, their knives clutched in their hands. Nothing of the sort. There was still that rustling noise, off to the left. He began to walk in that direction, not having to bowl through the corn anymore. The row was taking him in that direction. He wanted to go, naturally. The row ended up ahead. Ended? No, emptied out into something sort of clearing. The rustling was there. He stopped, suddenly afraid. The scent of the corn was strong enough to be cloying. The rows held onto that sun's heat, and he became aware that he was plastered with sweat and chafe and thin spider strands of corn silk. Bugs ought to be crawling all over him, but they weren't. He stood still, staring toward that place where the corn opened out onto what looked like a large circle of bare earth. There were no minges or mosquitoes in here, no black flies or chiggers, what he and Vicky had called the drive-in bugs when they had been courting. And he thought with sudden and unexpectedly sad nostalgia. And he hadn't seen a single crow. How was that for weird? A corn patch with no crows. In the last of the daylight, he swept his eyes closely over the row of corn to his left, and saw that every leaf and stalk was perfect, which was just not possible. No yellow blight, no tattered leaves, no caterpillar eggs, no burrows, no... His eyes widened. My God, there aren't any weeds! Not a single one. Every 1.5 foot of the corn plants rose from the earth. There was no witchgrass, jimson, pikeweed, horsehair, or poke salad. Nothing! Bert stared up, eyes wide. The light in the west was fading. The raftered clouds had drawn back together. Below them, the golden light had faded to pink and ochre. It would be dark soon enough. It was time to go down to the clearing in the corn and see what was there. Hadn't that been the plan all along? All the time he had thought he was cutting back to the highway. Hadn't he been being led to this place? Dread in his belly, he went on down to the row and stood at the edge of the clearing. There was enough light left for him to see what was here. He couldn't scream. There didn't seem to be enough air left in his lungs. He tottered in on legs like slats of splintery wood. His eyes bulged from his sweaty face. "Vicky," he whispered. "Oh, Vicky, my God." She had been mounted on a crossbar like a hideous trophy. Her arms held at the wrists and her legs at the ankles with twists of common barbed wire. 70 cents a yard at any hardware store in Nebraska. Her eyes had been ripped out. The sockets were filled with the moonflax of corn silk. Her jaws were wrenched open in a silent scream, her mouth filled with corn husks. On her left was a skeleton in a moldering surplice. The new jawbone grinned. The eye sockets seemed to stare at Bert jocularly, as if the one-time minister of the Grace Baptist Church was saying, "It's not so bad. Being sacrificed by pagan devil children in the corn is not so bad. Having your eyes ripped out of your skull according to the laws of Moses is not so bad." To the left of the skeleton in the surplice was a second skeleton, this one dressed in a rotting blue uniform. A hat hung over the skull, shading the eyes, and on the peak of the cap was a greenish-tinged badge reading Police Chief. That was when Bert heard it coming. Not the children, but something much larger, moving through the corn and toward the clearing. Not the children. No, the children wouldn't venture into the corn at night. This was the holy place, the place of he who walks behind the rows. Jerkily, Bert turned to flee. The row he had entered the clearing by was gone, closed up. All the rows had closed up. It was coming closer now, and he could hear it pushing through the corn. He could hear it breathing. An ecstasy of superstitious terror seized him. It was coming. The corn on the far side of the clearing had suddenly darkened, as if a gigantic shadow had blotted it out. Coming. He who walks behind the rows. It began to come into the clearing. Bert saw something huge, bulking up to the sky. Something green with terrible red eyes in the size of footballs. Something that smelled like dry corn husks, years in some dark barn. He began to scream, but he did not scream long. Sometime later, a bloated orange harvest moon came up. The children of the corn stood in the clearing at midday, looking at the 2 crucified skeletons and the crude bodies. The bodies were not skeletons yet, but they would be, in time. And here in the heartland of Nebraska, in the corn, there was nothing but time. Behold, a dream came to me in the night, and the Lord did shew all this to me. They all turned to look at Isaac with dread and wonder, even Malachi. Isaac was only 9, but he had been the seer since the corn had taken David a year ago. David had been 19, and he had walked into the corn on his birthday, just as dusk had come drifting down over the summer rows. Now a small face, grave under his round hat, Isaac continued, "And in my dream the Lord was a shadow that walked behind the rows, and he spoke to me in the words he used our brothers years ago. He is much displeased with this sacrifice." They made a sighing, sobbing noise and looked at the surrounding walls of green. "And the Lord did say, Have I not given you a place of killing that you might make sacrifice there? And have I not shewn you favor? But this man has made a blasphemy within me, and I have completed this sacrifice myself, like the blue man and the false minister who escaped many years ago. The blue man, the false minister, they whispered and looked at each other uneasily. So now is the age of favor lowered from 19 plantings and harvestings to 18. Isaac went on relentlessly. Yet be fruitful and multiply as the corn multiplies, that my favor may be shewn upon you, and be upon you. Isaac ceased. The eyes turned to Malachi and Joseph, the only two among this party who were 18. There were others back in town, perhaps 20 in all. They waited to hear what Malachi would say. Malachi, who had led the hunt for Japheth, who evermore would be known as Ahaz, cursed of God. Malachi had cut the throat of Ahaz and had thrown his body out of the corn so that the foul body would not pollute it or blight it. I obey the word of God, Malachi whispered. The corn seemed to sigh its approval. In the weeks to come, the girls would make many corn-cob crucifixes to ward off further evil. And that night, all of those now above the age of favor walked silently into the corn, and went to the clearing to gain the continued favor of he who walks behind the rows. "Goodbye, Malachi," Ruth called. She waved disconsolately. Her belly was big with Malachi's child, and tears coursed silently down her cheeks. Malachi did not turn. His back was straight. The corn swallowed him. Ruth turned away, still crying. She had conceived a secret hatred for the corn, and sometimes dreamed of walking into it with a torch in each hand when dry September came, and the stalks were dead and explosively combustible. But she also feared it. Out there, in the night, something walked, and it saw everything, even the secrets kept in human hearts. Dusk deepened into the night. Around Gatlin the corn rustled and whispered secretly. It was well pleased.